Muy bien. ¿Estamos al aire? Perfecto, muy bien. Muchas gracias al equipo técnico. Muy buenos días a todas, todos, todes, a la gente que nos acompaña en línea, a la gente que nos acompaña en este auditorio del Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas. Mi nombre es Alejandro Monsiváis y tengo el honor de presentar y introducir a nuestro conferencista magistral, el doctor Sidney Tarrow.
Muy buenos días.
Antes de hacerlo,
todas,
quiero
todos.
Auditorio del Magistral, al Consejo Mexicano de Ciencias Sociales,
mi nombre
la
es
entidad
Monsiváis,
que reúne
tengo el honor de
presentar
universidades
y entidades académicas del país.
Muy
Estamos
buenas,
celebrando
muy buenos
el
días.
octavo
Antes de
Congreso
hacerlo, quiero
Nacional
todos
de Ciencias Sociales. En particular, agradezco al doctor Jorge Cadena Roa, secretario ejecutivo de Comexo, quien ha sido la persona que nos ha permitido contar esta mañana con la presencia del doctor Sidney Tarrow. Sin mayor dilación, porque en esta ocasión lo que importa es escuchar al profesor, voy a introducirlo de manera muy general. Sidney Tarrow es profesor emérito de gobierno en la Universidad de Cornell, en la Escuela de Derecho. Es Emeritus Maxwell Upson Professor of Government and Adjunct Professor of Cornell Law School. Conocemos su obra, es una obra inmensa, muy influyente en América Latina, que ha abierto agendas de investigación, ha sido inspiradora para varias generaciones de personas que hacemos investigación sociológica y politológica, y sociología política, desde luego, en la política contenciosa, en la construcción de instituciones. Desde la obra, una de las obras, entre las muchas que hay, Dynamics of Contention, with Charles Tilly y Doug McAdam, la obra del profesor Tarrow, insisto, ha sido muy influyente en nuestros horizontes teóricos, metodológicos y en nuestros intereses sustantivos de investigación. Muchas gracias y muy buenos días, profesor Tarrow. Please go ahead. Doug McAdam, la obra del profesor Tarrow, insisto, ha sido muy influyente en nuestros horizontes teóricos, metodológicos y en nuestros intereses sustantivos de investigación. Muchas gracias y muy buenos días, profesor Tarrow. Please go ahead. Professor Tarrow, you may start with your lecture.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I will begin to speak. So my lecture, which is based on some recent publications, begins with the presidential election in the United States in November 2020. You will all remember that Donald Trump lost that election by some 9 million votes. He and his followers refused to concede the election to his opponent, Joseph Biden, and they triggered a mob that launched an insurrection on the American Capitol. By some 9 million votes. He and his followers, as is well known, after 2 years, a congressional committee subpoenaed Trump to testify, and the Federal Justice Department launched a criminal investigation into his actions. As I speak, the attorneys general of New York State and the state of Georgia have referred Trump and his family for criminal charges. And the Federal Justice Department has launched a criminal investigation into his actions. What happens next, we will wait and see. In the meantime, on October 28th of this year, President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil lost his presidential election by a razor-thin margin. He too accused his opponent, former President Ignacio da Silva, of electoral irregularities after his followers among truck drivers and the Federal Highway Police tried to stop Lula's voters from getting to the polls. Yet hours after the election, most of Bolsonaro's allies accepted his loss. 3 days later, the outgoing Brazilian president announced the election is over. Yet hours after the election, most of Bolsonaro's allies. I want to use this comparison to illustrate the thesis of my talk. I will not focus on the similarities and differences between these two countries or these two elections. Drawing on my book, Movements and Parties, and on an earlier book, to illustrate the thesis of my talk. I will not focus on the similarities and differences between these two countries or these two elections. Drawing on my book, Movements and Parties, and on an earlier book, to illustrate the thesis of my talk. I will not focus on the similarities and differences between these two countries or these two elections. Drawing on my book, Movements and Parties, and on an earlier book, to illustrate the thesis of my talk. I will not focus on the similarities and differences between these two countries or these two elections. Drawing on my book, Movements and Parties, and on an earlier book, comparative politics to American politics. And I argued that the conjunction between movements and parties has recurred over and over in North American politics, and the categorical distinction between movements and parties has been overdrawn by scholars. Many scholars have identified social movements as a form of contentious politics that combines sustained campaigns of claims-making with public displays of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. And I've quoted myself with Charles Tilley in our 2015 book, Contentious Politics, that combines sustained campaigns of claims-making with that definition has served us well through decades of research. But as the party systems of the global North have begun to hollow out, the movement repertoire has begun to push its way into the repertoire of the party system and vice versa. Through decades of research. Latin Americans have always known about these interactions between parties and movements, because many of the regime changes in your region have been accompanied by or were caused by the intersection of movements and parties. For example, most recently in Chile, the estallido social forced political elites to call a referendum in which the establishment parties were forced to call a referendum and were largely wiped out in the referendum that followed. But the United States, with its long-standing two-party system, has more often seen movements disappear or become absorbed by one of the two major parties. In movements and parties, I tried to bring movements directly into the party system. In a chapter I called The Hybridization of the Party System, I argued that the US party system increasingly overlaps with social movements. The intersection of movements and parties is an international phenomenon. In Europe, Herbert Kitchelt used the concept of movement parties to describe the juncture between the ecological movement and the Green Party. After the Great Recession, Donatella Della Porta and her collaborators developed the concept further for the party movements that arose against austerity in Southern Europe. From this growing convergence of party and movement research, scholars in the United States have been largely absent. This was in part because of the large persuasion that the United States is exceptional, and in part because social movement and political party research have taken very different methodological paths in my country. But over the last decade, the Tea Party, the Koch network, Trumpism, and the counter-movement against it have provided empirical foundations for a bridge between party and social movement research. In their recent collection, Democratic Resilience, Robert Lieberman and his collaborators even led a few comparativists under the tent. In my remarks, I will draw on the typology of movements and institutions from a landmark study of the relations between American movements and the presidency by Sidney Milkus and Daniel Titchener, called Rivalry and Reform. Here's a simplified version of their typology, built on the intersection of two main variables. First, the extent to which movements access institutions, and second, what I call their contentious capacity. Here's a simplified version. I think the plates have moved more quickly than my lecture. Could you please go back to plate 5 and 6? That's it. Plate 6 is what. Plate 6 is now perfect. Thank you. My argument is that movement-party relations take many forms, but that they only succeed when they involve the combination that we see in the lower right quadrant of this typology, what Milkus and Titchener call formative movements, which tend to appear during critical moments in history. In their book, they argue that movements that fail to combine institutional and extra-institutional politics lead to what they call marginalization. Other movements exercise opposition, but do not engage with institutions. This is what they call militant movements. Still others slide into institutional politics to the degree that loses them the mass basis that is their major resource. This is what they call institutional movements. Only when movements bridge institutional and non-institutional politics, what they call formative movements, can they effectively challenge the regime. As an example of a marginal movement, I will look briefly at the American Occupy movement. After it burst on the scene over a decade ago, we no longer hear much about it. That was because it failed to engage in effective extra or intra-institutional action. My second example will be of a militant movement, the one that I studied in Italy in the 1960s, in the extra-parliamentary left. This movement spiraled into terrorism, rapidly losing mass support and triggering the repressive efforts of the Italian state. An institutional movement that I'll briefly discuss was the Brazilian Partido dos Trabalhadores, which gave up its claim to being a movement when it became a party.
This movement
Finally, as my example of a formative movement that effectively combined institutional and extra-institutional forms of action, I will turn to the transformation of the African National Congress into a party without fully giving up its movement identity. First, turning to Occupy Wall Street. Beginning in 2011, Occupy Wall Street erupted in the heart of global capitalism. It targeted global greed and neo-capitalism in general, and it spread rapidly around the country and to other parts of the world. Unlike the near simultaneous events in Tunisia and Egypt, its adherents, they would reject the term leaders, had no political party target, but they generated a slogan, "We are the 99%," that diffused across the country. Eventually forced out of their encampment in Lower Manhattan, veterans of the movement attempted to keep it alive, but without notable success. With its central performance, the occupation of urban space, and its slogan of representing the 99%, the movement diffused rapidly across the country. As Bogdan Vasi and Chan Su showed in their analysis of the first 50 days of the movement, it spread to over 200 cities through a combination of digital and offline diffusion. This figure summarizes their findings. Plate 8, please. Thank you. Vasi and Su's findings do not simply reveal the rapid spread of a movement. They also showed how much its diffusion depended on online diffusion. But within a few months, after the movement exploded on the streets of Manhattan, it began to decline. The reason? Their refusal to create formal organizations gave rise to a consensus model of decision-making that maximized participation but minimized hierarchy. The problem was that the demand for consensus put the most uncompromising militants in a position where they could veto the tactics and the strategy proposed by the vast majority of their comrades. But there was a serious disadvantage. Through its ease of online diffusion, its emphasis shifted as it moved from the physical core on Wall Street to its digital periphery. As Lance Bennett and his collaborators pointed out, peripheral networks, online networks, shifted the emphasis in the movement's framing from the banks and the financial system to the more encompassing frame of inequality. Most important, the movement never confronted the problem of its relations to institutions. Occupying the space outside of financial institutions was a militant performance, but the absence of clear programmatic preferences made it impossible to engage in negotiation. The result, despite the movement's explosion on the scene, was what Milkes and Titchener called a marginal movement, one that had largely disappeared by the 2012 elections. Now let's turn to a militant movement, the one that I studied in Italy in the 1960s and 70s. The attention of most scholars on the 60s movements in Italy was riveted on the violence of the Red Brigades and other terrorist groups. But between the terrorists and the institutional party system, there was a family of extra-parliamentary organizations that did not engage in armed struggle, but were reluctant to support the institutional left. They were what we can safely call militant movements. The extra-parliamentary left eventually tried to enter institutional politics, but it failed miserably. Its most important group, Lotta Continua, the continuing struggle, split over a conflict with its feminist members, and it broke apart after the 1976 elections, when some leaders joined the terrorists and others moved into the institutional parties of the left. Third, I want to turn to the familiar picture of the Partido dos Trabajadores in Brazil. You will all know better than I do the story of that party, which has just re-elected Lula as president, so I won't spend much time discussing it. It began as a militant party, but as Wendy Hunter and Margaret Keck both showed in their books, it gradually made the compromises that led it into the party system. While the party did forge close ties with the Movimiento dos Trabajadores Rurais Sem Terra, that movement's single-minded focus on the land made it difficult for the PT to employ its support for its institutional strategy as it sought to come to power. The PT is a classical movement that became an institution. Now let me turn to the most interesting case of the four, and that is, excuse me, a formative movement that came to power. On the other side of the world, the leaders of the African National Congress also made the shift to a formative movement without losing its movement base. That movement struggled for years to decide whether to become an armed guerrilla movement or a multiracial party seeking to defeat an all-white establishment at the polls. Sociologist Gay Seidman pointed to this dilemma in her article, Guerrillas in Their Midst. In the meantime, township protests and strikes led by the COSATU labor organization began to affect the flow of capital into the country. In her book, Forging Democracy from Below, Elizabeth Wood showed how private capital flows into South Africa responded to the rise of the anti-apartheid insurgency. In her book, she showed that white business associations began to promote the benefits of non-racial democracy. The groups began meeting with civil servants, with diplomats, and with government representatives, and eventually with the ANC. It would serve as the key broker between the movement's leaders and the ruling white National Party in the negotiations that led to the elections and approval of a new constitution. Complicating these relations was the fact that not all Africans were ANC followers, and not all whites supported the National Party's negotiations with the ANC. As the negotiations promised to come to fruition, the powerful Zulu-based Inkatha movement began to attack ANC headquarters in a bid to insert itself forcefully in whatever post-transfer government resulted from the negotiations. At the same time, far-right white elements broke away from the nationalists and tried to undermine that party's efforts to forge a multiracial solution. Yet despite these divisions, South Africa became a proponent of human rights and a leader of the African continent. Despite the ravages of HIV/AIDS and the pandemic, in 2021, the country scored 33 out of 40 on Freedom House's measure of political liberties and 44 out of 60 on its measure of civil rights. In contrast to the decline of constitutional democracy, in many parts of the world, South Africa remained a diverse, multiracial democracy. This is not the place in which to detail all the reasons that contributed to South Africa's transition. But one factor that relates closely to my theme was the successful transition of the ANC from an insurgent movement with a powerful guerrilla wing into an institutional party that retained its movement identity. American election consultant Stanley Greenberg, who advised Mandela in the 1994 election campaign, tells the story this way. The initial instinct of the movement was to frame the campaign around the apocalyptic theme, "Now is the time." That slogan had an obvious appeal for Black activists who had fought for years to free themselves from the yoke of apartheid. But there were dangers in such an electoral strategy. First, it would inspire fear in the white business class. Second, it would alienate the international community on which the ANC would depend for legitimation. And third, the substantial colored and Indian communities would feel no allegiance to a movement led by a slogan with a clear racial bias. Fighting the election on a movement slogan that resonated with past struggles would leave us mired in the past, Greenberg argued to his ANC clients. Given the anti-ANC reaction from both Inkatha and the white supremacists, it's remarkable that Mandela and his team resisted confronting their opponents. His reasoning was that a violent confrontation among Africans would give the white establishment a pretext for stopping the transition. In the event, the transition was a double one. At the national level, from a white supremacist regime to a multiracial democracy, from a formative social movement to a governing political party. Now, except for the brief episode of the Occupy movement at the beginning, I've had little to say so far about the country at the core of my book, Movements and Parties. Let me close this talk by briefly returning to the Trump movement and its relations to institutional politics. In their interview research with activists in the movement that Donald Trump founded, Rachel Bloom and Chris Parker found that only about half of these activists identified with the Republican Party. Another group identified with the Trump-inspired Stop the Steal campaign. As this figure shows in the next plate, thank you, the largest group came from the gun rights movement, over 1,000 out of 1,348 respondents. The Trump movement is a formative movement which uses the Republican Party to legitimate itself and to exercise political power. How intimately is the Trump movement connected to the Republican Party? Rather than a detailed argument which would be the topic of another talk, let me close with an example of the party's current dilemma. Early this year, the Republican National Committee passed a resolution censoring, Sue, will you get that? Early this year, the Republican National Committee passed a resolution censoring the two Republican House members, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who were taking part in the deliberations of the House Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection. The RNC condemned them for joining a Democratic Party attack on what it called legitimate political discourse. You heard me correctly. The violent effort to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election was characterized as legitimate political discourse. In the media commentary that followed, observers credited this move by the Republicans to its fealty to the ex-president. I have a different view. I think the committee was responding to the power of the movement that Trump created, which I think will survive long after he is forgotten or goes to prison for his crimes. The Trump movement, in this case, has filled the hollow in the party. Is Trumpism a formative movement in Milkus and Titchener's lexicon, or is it a militant movement in an uneasy relationship with a political party? At the moment, the movement and the party appear to be in an uneasy relationship that could disintegrate after the midterm elections, but could also bring Donald Trump back to power in 2024. Tuesday's midterm election results are not yet completely understood, but they show that the founder of the Trump movement may have lost control of the two branches of the movement he founded. The thugs in paratrooper outfits trying to prevent voters from voting, and the subservient congressional candidates who bow down to kiss the ring of the founder. These variations in the movement-party relationship could be endlessly expanded. For example, in the 1930s in your own country, Lázaro Cárdenas established peasant leagues responsible for distributing plots of collective land, the ejidos. And in his study of the Bolivian Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia, Santiago Anrilla showed that movement parties do not always lose their movement properties when they shift into institutional politics. In his book, Anrilla developed a thick anatomy of the mass, which showed how a party formed by social movements after more than a decade in power, quote, still deviates from the conventional wisdom on parties. Although he does not adopt Milkus and Titchener's language, the mass was what they would call a formative movement. Anrilla shows how not all movements that enter the electoral contest lose their movement-like characteristics. In his study of the Bolivian Movimiento al Socialismo, he showed that movement parties do not always lose their movement properties when they shift into institutional politics. The future of party politics will be varied through the range of representative democracies. I hope I've shown that the best way to understand their dynamics may have to run through the interaction of parties and movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tarrow. I am going to deliver my commentary in Spanish, but I will display some slides. So Professor Tarrow may follow my remarks and observations. Please, ¿podrían proyectar el PowerPoint? The PowerPoint in movement. Okay, thank you very much. Well, este es un comentario a la conferencia del doctor Tarrow, basado en lo que nos ha compartido de viva voz, pero también basado en su libro más reciente. Si pasamos a la siguiente, por favor. Ok. Esta es una introducción general. En esta conferencia y en este libro, en su libro más reciente, Movements and Parties, Critical Connections in American Political Development, el profesor Tarrow abre nuevas agendas muy estimulantes de investigación en la política comparada y en particular en el área de la política contenciosa, pero con el giro específicamente hacia la relación entre los movimientos y los partidos políticos. Los planteamientos que ha formulado y que formula en su libro son y deben ser de gran interés para todas aquellas personas que estamos interesadas e interesados en investigar la construcción de la representación política y lo que en inglés se llama el Democratic Accountability, que es traducido como rendición de cuentas democrática, que tiene un sentido más amplio de lo puramente administrativo que connota este término. Y hay un aspecto tanto en la conferencia como en el libro en el cual quiero enfocarme. Y para esto voy a citar una frase, una serie de ideas con el cual el profesor Tarrow cierra su libro. La cita es textual. Esta cita alude a esta frase de Martin Luther King Jr. que dice que el arco de la moral universal tiende a girar, a inclinarse hacia la justicia. Y si esto es cierto, señala Tarrow, se debe a que las combinaciones, la intersección, la coincidencia entre movimientos sociales y partidos políticos puede contribuir, puede orientarse hacia la resiliencia de la democracia. Desde luego, el profesor Tarrow en su libro, en su argumento y en parte de lo que nos acaba de compartir, es muy claro al señalar que, como dice también un texto clásico de dos autores muy reconocidos, Charles Steele y Robert Woodin, it depends. It depends on the political process. Nada garantiza que la combinación entre movimientos y partidos va a redundar en el fortalecimiento o inclusive en la estabilidad de la democracia. Puede tener consecuencias opuestas. Pasamos a la siguiente, por favor. Y en particular, esta diapositiva, this slide, is seeking to summarize the book's argument. El profesor Tarrow señala que la interacción entre movimientos sociales y partidos políticos es clave, crucial, para entender tanto la marcha para salvar América, the March to Save America, y el asalto al Capitolio el 6 de enero de 2020, como la amenaza todavía vigente y presente que representa el movimiento impulsado, iniciado por Donald Trump, es MAGA, Make America Great Again. A partir de este planteamiento sostiene, es el origen de la investigación, que la literatura sobre la relación entre movimientos sociales y partidos políticos acerca en el campo, digamos, en el American Politics, la literatura americana, the American Scholarship on the Relationship Between Movements and Political Parties, is very scarce. No hay mucho, en buena medida porque los analistas especializados en movimientos sociales dialogan poco con la gente que estudia partidos políticos y viceversa, ¿sí? Los movimientos sociales se asume que son entidades múltiples, dinámicas, contenciosas, que articulan intereses. Por otro lado, los partidos políticos agregan, representan intereses en las instancias legislativas y de decisión política. Son dos esferas que han sido analizadas completamente en campos diferentes, y este libro lo que nos ofrece es una reconstrucción desde mediados del siglo XIX hasta la actualidad de la relación entre movimientos y partidos en los Estados Unidos de América. Este libro es una reconstrucción histórica, analítica, sumamente sugerente, estimulante y reveladora de las complejas dinámicas entre partidos y movimientos. Ahora bien, sobre esta base quiero hacer mis comentarios relacionados con la América Latina. I don't have much to say about Professor Tarrow's argument. I think it's quite stimulating. And I wish to reflect on his remarks, on his contributions to research on social movements and political parties from the point of view of we Latin Americans. So, la siguiente diapositiva, por favor. La pregunta es, ¿qué tanto el arco moral, el arco de la moralidad universal se está inclinando realmente hacia la justicia en América Latina? Si esa es la expectativa que nos hace albergar Martin Luther King, tenemos que pensar realmente qué tanto esto es una realidad empírica y por qué en nuestros países. Hay varias razones que hacen diferente, que son, desde una perspectiva comparada, son cuestiones que es importante tener en cuenta, porque hacen diferente los casos latinoamericanos del caso como el estadounidense, sin que eso signifique que esto implica creer en la excepcionalidad norteamericana. Lo que caracteriza a los países latinoamericanos son sistemas de partidos débiles, poco institucionalizados, desorganizados, caóticos, fluidos. El vínculo representativo entre votantes y partidos representantes es muy tenue, muy débil, muy errático. Existe un enorme descontento ciudadano, existe mucha desconfianza hacia las instituciones políticas y lo que se observa en los distintos países de la región es que hay coincidencias contingentes entre la política contenciosa y los partidos políticos. En ocasiones coinciden, sobre todo como coinciden en momentos claves electorales, en elecciones críticas, en elecciones importantes, pero también pueden estar en oposición y contradicción unos con otros, partidos y movimientos. Desde un punto de vista más amplio, en América Latina enfrentamos el reto de hacer que nuestras democracias sean resilientes, que resistan los impulsos que las están erosionando, que sean capaces de revertir el declive institucional, el declive en el debate público, en la cultura política, y girar hacia un fortalecimiento democrático. Con todo, lo que tenemos en esta región es una amplia variedad de trayectorias de desarrollo democrático. Hay altibajos, hay países que se convierten en regímenes autoritarios y luego regresan. Estoy pensando en el caso de Ecuador, estoy pensando en Bolivia también, que en este caso se encuentra en un momento favorable para la construcción democrática, lo que no implica que no haya tensiones, y países que enfrentan procesos de autocratización como algunos que conocemos. No entraré en detalle en ese momento todavía, pero bueno, Nicaragua, que ya es un autoritarismo pleno. Y concluyo con esta diapositiva, con la siguiente, para dar espacio a la conversación de la audiencia con el doctor Tarrow. A partir de las consideraciones que he realizado, creo que es importante, identifico 3 ejes principales para orientar la investigación. La primera es la intersección entre movimientos y partidos políticos en la expansión de derechos en América Latina. Hay casos muy interesantes, muy afortunados, y pienso específicamente, entre otros, en los movimientos feministas que han impulsado y expandido el reconocimiento de derechos. No solamente derechos hacia la libertad sexual, hacia la reproducción, derechos reproductivos, también hay progresos en términos de derechos representativos como la paridad o la búsqueda de la igualdad sustantiva en el ejercicio de la representación política. Sin embargo, esta intersección fructífera, virtuosa entre movimientos y partidos para la construcción de derechos no es necesariamente el rasgo general. También tenemos una relación contingente entre movimientos y partidos en relación con la democracia. Yo me pregunto e invito a reflexionar al respecto acerca de qué tanto estos movimientos institucionalizados, para recuperar la tipología que describió el profesor Tarrow, o los movimientos formativos, en los cuales hay coincidencia entre una alta capacidad contenciosa del movimiento y una alta capacidad institucional, presencia electoral, posibilidad de elegir candidatos del partido, qué tanto estos movimientos formativos están teniendo impactos en la resiliencia de la democracia. Y sin pensarlo mucho, creo que hay 2 casos de estudio muy interesantes, muy relevantes en la actualidad, el caso brasileño, el caso mexicano. En Brasil me pregunto qué tanto el movimiento bolsonarista puede ser descrito como un caso de movimiento formativo, de formative movement, dado que a pesar, un poco como sucede ahora con las elecciones en Estados Unidos, a pesar de la derrota electoral de Bolsonaro, de Jair Bolsonaro, el movimiento bolsonarista está vivito y coleando, tiene una enorme energía y tiene mucha presencia legislativa y en gobiernos locales. No es un movimiento que vaya a desaparecer en los próximos meses y por el contrario, parece que estará presente en la política brasileña durante un buen tiempo. ¿Es un movimiento formativo? ¿Qué relación tiene durante la gestión de Bolsonaro, después de Bolsonaro, con la resiliencia de la democracia? Lo mismo puedo preguntarme de manera similar en el caso mexicano. ¿Qué tipo de movimiento partido es Morena? Uno pensaría que también es un movimiento formativo, alta capacidad contenciosa, alta capacidad institucional, es el partido dominante hoy en día en México. Sin embargo, si uno lo reflexiona, y esta es una conjetura abierta a escrutinio, no estoy seguro que Morena sea realmente un movimiento social. Ha sido sobre todo una organización electoral movilizada y encabezada por un líder que utilizó esta movilización, este partido, para contender por la presidencia y ser electo titular del Poder Ejecutivo. Y me lleva a la tercera conjetura y a la tercera pregunta. En Estados Unidos, en el caso que analiza el profesor Tarrow, tenemos 2 partidos bastante institucionalizados. Tenemos un electorado bastante estable en términos de su identificación partidista. El partidismo es sólido en Estados Unidos. Si bien, como muestra el libro, como muestra la conferencia, el Partido Republicano se ha vaciado en la cúpula y se ha conectado con los grassroots movements de extrema derecha, derecha cristiana, el MAGA, el Tea Party, etc. En México, nuestros partidos están poco institucionalizados. Bueno, nuestro sistema de partidos está en transición, está cambiando. No es el mismo sistema que hace 10 años y las y los votantes tienen una identificación partidista muy frágil, muy poco arraigada. La pregunta es entonces, ¿qué rol desempeñan en la articulación entre movimientos sociales y partidos políticos? En casos como México, donde el sistema de partidos está poco institucionalizado, los líderes carismáticos, caudillistas, populistas. Creo que en buena medida América Latina ofrece la posibilidad de examinar este otro elemento contingente, contextual, para seguir indagando en la línea a la cual nos invita el profesor Tarrow con su conferencia y su libro más reciente. Muchas gracias, agradezco mucho la oportunidad. Me gustaría abrir el micrófono para que quien tenga interés pueda participar y escucharemos hacia el final una reflexión del profesor Tarrow. Les vamos a pedir que sean muy breves para dar lugar a que todo el mundo participe.
Bueno, mi nombre es José Armando Pineda Rosandi. Bueno, hoy la discusión en torno a la democracia en México y en el mundo es un tema de la mayor envergadura y aparte yo creo que es uno de los ejes de la seguridad hemisférica. Me parece a mí que el desarrollismo financiero neoliberal y hoy afortunadamente las democracias se orientan hacia una socialdemocracia. Esto hay que situarlo de una manera de bastante interés, porque lo comentado por el doctor a propósito de lo que está ocurriendo ahorita en las elecciones de Estados Unidos nos lleva a situar la importancia que tiene en este Congreso la valoración de las ciencias sociales en términos de...
Disculpe, voy a pedirle que sea muy puntual con su comentario, por favor, porque tenemos más personas interesadas.
Entonces, repito, las ciencias sociales, su valoración de diagnósticos, de perspectivas, sitúan realmente ver, digamos ya en concreto, que la democracia representativa debe de ser vista desde el punto de vista de la sociedad civil, de la academia. Me parece a mí que en una democratización que vaya de la gobernabilidad, la gobernanza, en donde la democracia tenga ya terminó. Digo, da posibilidad de conversar, ¿no? Tenemos una universidad con todas las instalaciones, pero no deliberamos, no argumentamos, no interpretamos. La democracia hay que hacerlo. Bueno, yo concluyo. De la democracia representativa a la democracia ciudadanizada, parlamentarizada y en donde realmente la academia haga esfuerzos por crear mejores diagnósticos y perspectivas.
Muchas gracias. Acá está Johan Gordillo. If you could speak in English too.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sidney, for your presentation. It's always great to hear you and to read you. I have one question for Sidney and one for Alejandro. Sidney, you mentioned that even if Trump retires or goes to jail, the Trump movement will continue to mobilize. We know that political parties organized around a charismatic leader usually fail to institutionalize. However, social movements that rely strongly on leaders do last even if leaders go away. So can you share any more comments on this relationship between leaders, permanence, movements, and parties? And for Alejandro, I will speak in Spanish. El concepto de movimiento social suele tener una carga valorativa muy importante. Solemos pensar en los movimientos sociales como entes progresistas y por tanto benéficos para la democracia y la resiliencia de la democracia. Pero el caso del movimiento pro-Trump muestra que también pueden ser un riesgo. ¿Podrías reflexionar algo al respecto, por favor?
Somebody else, please. Okay. We may ask Professor Tarrow if he wishes some comments and answer the question from Johan. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. My first comment is to thank Alejandro for his careful reading of my book and of my lecture. He has found things in both of those that I had not suspected, which is always the danger when an intelligent reader studies a book that is less carefully written. I think one theme that is very important that comes up again and again in the book is whether the United States is as exceptional as we tend to think. And it caused me to reflect a little bit on what I know about the Mexican political development. And it occurred to me to say, for many of the same reasons why we think of our country as exceptional, Mexicans have the right to think of their country as exceptional as well. But one important factor in the history of Mexico has been the recurrence of strong political leaders whose leadership is tied to the leadership of the state. And that has been much less frequent in the United States than in Mexico or other Latin American countries. I think if Trump turns out to be a historic figure, and I'm not sure that he will, it would be because he tried to combine state power with movement power in a way that was very unusual in American history. When I think of the main leaders of movements that I deal with in the book, only two, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, came close to combining state power and movement power, and neither one of them was able to do so before they were prematurely lost their lives. So if Trump is special, he may be special in a way that is familiar to Latin American political development because of the effort to put together a movement power with state power. My second comment is with respect to more recent developments in Mexico. And here I'm really almost completely at a loss because I have not followed Mexican politics as closely as I should have, but I was struck in preparing for this talk by the conversations that I've found in the Mexican press about whether Mexico is approaching a new phase of authoritarian leadership. And here I'm drawn back to one of Alejandro's comments about Latin American political party systems in general. And that is about the weakness of the party systems in the historical trajectory of Latin America. If Mexico is headed towards a more authoritarian basis, it may look much more like the Bolsonaro period than like a true authoritarian period, because it lacks a strong basis in civil society. This is only a speculation on my part, based only on rapid reading of the recent Mexican press. And my final comment, before I thank the commentators, really reflects the question of how strong the party system of the United States is. I used the term earlier that comes from an American scholar, the hollowing out of the party system. And his name is Daniel Schlossman, and his book is called something like When Movements Become Parties. And he argues that increasingly American parties have become available to social movements for colonization, not because movements have become particularly strong, but because parties have become particularly weak. And if we look at the data on the actions of the national party systems in the United States, I think there's a lot of evidence that these party systems have become increasingly weakened. So in answer to the question about whether Trumpism is going to last beyond Trump, my speculation would be that Trumpism may well last beyond Trump, but not as a political party, because the Republican Party lacks the strength, the organizational strength, and the ideological consistency that would enable it to turn Trumpism into a movement authority. Thank you, and thank you again for this very flattering invitation and for the availability for me to interact with many of you in preparing for it.
Before saying the final word, Professor Tarrow, I would like to share with you Jorge Cadena's greetings. He says he has to leave early, but he's very fond of your work and yourself. And well, he basically says hello and see you soon. And as for myself, in the name of Comexo, I am truly grateful for your lecture, for your reflections, remarks. I find your comments on Mexico truly compelling. I think many of us are going to reflect on that and probably begin a new research project. Thank you very much. And again, it's great having you with us here in Comexo. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.